Good morning. I hope you're all more awake than I am, because I can do this talk on autopilot, because I've done it before, but there's bits in here that are going to make your brain cells die. Because what I specialize in is proving who did stuff when things were anonymous. And it certainly spent a lot of years making my brain cells die, being able to believe it really worked. The only thing that made me feel it really did work was when the US Patent Office just let 6 patents through in 6 months. I was like, okay, we've conned some people who actually care about detail. So this is never an easy topic to give a talk on, because people have very weird views about what counts as trust and what counts as identity. And programmers have this hideous belief that they're entitled to data. I know, I'm just as guilty of that. I mean, you can't build stuff that you can't see the data in until you've spent a lot of time building stuff you can see the data in, and hitting yourself over the head with a brickbat going, I can still see it, why can't I give up on that? And it's not an easy thing to do. So, I'm one half of a team who, through absolute mischance and a drunken night in 2003 at a goth festival in Whitby in North Yorkshire, became one of the world's leading teams in identity research. There aren't a lot of teams in identity research, so the bar for this is very low. On the other hand, there should be an awful lot more teams in identity research, because most people who are doing it still think it's all about tokens and numbers and facial recognition, all of which really sucks. It's not a very good way to do this stuff. My business partner is a cryptographer. He does the security. I am a physicist. Making things flow through interesting higher dimensions is my hobby. The confluence of the two is the confluence of two very disparate on the surface areas of mathematics training in universities that happens to turn out, when you get really down deep, to be almost identical. It's just, it takes a lot of years to really see that. And most of what we do is really, I guess, experimental computer science, which is quite unusual, because most people in computer science aren't interested in doing experiments, whereas everything we do is experimental. So most of what I'm going to talk about has only really been interested to the world at large for the last couple of years. And that's because our dear friends in the European Union have decided that if it comes into the European Union and it doesn't obey some bureaucratic ideas of what privacy is, they're going to try and chase you for money, a lot of money. Now, this is less relevant to American companies because you don't have these laws over here, unless you unfortunately have to play in our rather poisoned backyard of data privacy. But it's really onerous in the UK, and for the last 2 years, basically every company's been running around, pulling their hair out, going, how the hell do we comply with this legislation? There's stuff in there no one can comply with, like black box databases and things like that are still a research topic. I normally will spend my time doing these sort of talks. They're to a more general audience. I mean, Strange Loop is the one place where I know I can really abuse people's brains. Here and a couple of conferences in Europe, but most you can't. Normally, I spend most of my time talking about, can we target our dear friends Anonymous and the fact that, you know, there's all these bad actors on the internet who are pawning data. I would talk about our dear friends with the UFO at GCHQ and their Friends Electric over here who own store occasional databases in Utah. And then I would normally bring up some recent hack. Ashley Madison is obviously very old now. Some recent hack, and then spend about 10 minutes explaining how dumb-headed you have to be to actually want to store that data. I'm going to assume that all of you already have those opinions. If I'm wrong, that's fine. Come and buy me beer and we can talk about it. Identity in the UK is sort of similar and sort of different to identity in the States. And here I'm talking about legal identity, the stuff that courts care about, the stuff that governments care about. I don't actually know what particular documents you use over here to prove a person's identity. I know that some states at least have photo IDs. We have no photo ID in the UK. At the end of the war, everybody went out and burnt their identity cards, and any government ever since that suggested we should have identity papers in the UK has basically seen its poll ratings go, we don't like the idea. We're supposed to actually have them now because European law demands that every European citizen has them, and I suspect a large part of why we voted Brexit is actually to do with we don't want to have photos on a piece of paper that a policeman can insist we can show. Which of these over here do you think is a good proof of identity? Passport, maybe? The only one of these that's a legal identity document in the UK is that one. A deed of name change. Doesn't require state involvement at all, requires one witness. All you do is say you're changing your name. With that, I can get a passport without any further investigation. As we use some of the best e-passport tech in the world, due to GCHQ being very, very good at cryptography, our passport, once you've got it, is incredibly trustworthy, as not tampered with, except by a state actor. However, this is in no way trustworthy. It is just a piece of paper with 3 names on. Unfortunately, most people who do identity don't ever look at identity documents. They don't think about what legally identity is. Now, this is frustrating because I really want to be running around over there, or possibly over there. So I have killed, half-killed cameramen before by running around faster than they could move the camera. Most of the chatter these days in the identity world is about things called attributes. And an attribute is nothing more or less complicated than hair, black. This is not new stuff. The very first handwritten paper passports produced after the Conference of Vienna in the 1830s had hair, black, distinguishing marks, tattoos, description of face, ovoid, or intelligent, or beardy. These are attributes. Effectively, the digital world is trying to reinvent the 1830s at present. Attributes are not very interesting. They're not very interesting for a number of different reasons. Firstly, they're very small bits of data. If I'm going to give you a very small piece of data over an internet connection, I cannot encrypt it very securely unless I have buried it in a much larger encrypted stream. Because otherwise, I'm probably going to have padding errors and all kinds of other little tricks that cryptographers go, oh, fine, I know your data. Especially if I'm passing around the fact that your age is 12. Age 12 is a very easy one to game because it's a 2-digit number. So, attributes on their own are fairly lousy. Also, attribute tech, when you view it that way, doesn't cope with blank attributes very well. A blank attribute is actually a very valid piece of data. Okay, I have dark hair. I wear black. I'm not a professional cryptographer, so that's not my description. That's my business partner's description. But what if he doesn't have any hair? The value of no hair is no hair, none. It is a nil value. Okay? That lovely thing that we all hate in functional programming, nil values. So attributes are a really bad way of thinking about people on their own. Also, we live in a world that has become very obsessed with the technology that does not provide the anonymity that we keep being told it does. Blockchain. And I can't really complain. I use blockchaining techniques all the time in my work. I just don't like public blockchains because proof of work is expensive and slow and tedious and boring, and eventually the world is going to melt because all the computers will be calculating what the next transaction should be. So we would ideally like a world in which we're capable of being anonymous, in which we have that every day. If I walk down the street, currently I am not very anonymous. I'm making a very big point of not being very anonymous, and I'm on a stage in front of an audience. I'm definitely not anonymous, right? But when I walk down the street, even in my hometown, I am, for the most part, completely anonymous. Nobody knows my name or anything about me. They just see this blob of flesh walking down the street in whatever state happens to suit whatever time of day and whether or not I've been out that night for a band or something, at which point it might not look at all distinguishable from any other blob of flesh you see. And that is what we would like to have in databases to protect us, precisely because if we don't have anonymity, we have just become the most monitored victims of panopticon technology in history, because computers can do searches so bloody fast on such large data sets that only true anonymity can protect our data from somebody who wants to correlate our lives. And I'll get onto that later. Now, this over here is still anonymous. That's just a face in the crowd. But as we add extra bits of data in, we move into pseudonymity. This is what public blockchains are mostly offering us. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, that's me. right? Pseudonymity is not a good thing, because look at that. I mean, look at how much data pseudonymity is giving away, even when it's only giving away that bit of data. There are only so many people who joined Twitter on August 2007. And if that can be correlated with any other piece of data in my life, suddenly somebody can start tracking me in ways that you do not want machines to be able to automatically do, unless you are China. I'm not China. I wish I had the budget of China. So I don't normally put genuinely good literary quotes in, especially not hackneyed ones that everybody knows. Normally I pick them from obscure fantasy novels because it's more fun. But we have known about this difference between names and things for a long time. We can take it back to the bloody Pythagoreans and everything is reducible to a number, if we really want to. That rose doesn't stop having all of the attributes of a rose just because I decide to call it a carnation or Albert. It still stays exactly what it is. It's of a certain particular constructional form. It's got certain properties. Unfortunately, that is not how programmers think. I know that because A, I've spent an awful lot of years as a programmer, and B, I really did get quite deep into object technology at one time, and as a sometimes recovering Rubyist, I really do care about the naming of things, because if it's not just right, it's not catching what I really wanted to capture. And that's an artifact of the fact we live in code, which is a language that only really has a literary form and doesn't really pinion to anything in the real world unless the computer does. As a result, we have, at our bottom level of how we do identity in the real world, we have the idea of secure tokens. So you've got the whole Bluetooth low enemy, let's tap our phones. I mean, there's a whole thing called the FIDO Alliance, which for the last 15 years has been trying to get its particular international standard to be the one that lives in all of our phones and all of our passports. Secure tokens aren't secure, because they're not actually something that comes from me. They're something I carry, which means it can be stolen. They've got digital content, which means somebody with the right equipment can copy them. And yes, that's very difficult. And companies like Desfire will assure you their kit can't be gamed, and it's X-ray proof and all of this. But honestly, have you ever actually tried to do that with their kit? Have you been in their fab plants and seen how to do it? I haven't. I don't have confidence, therefore, that what they say is true. I don't have trust in that. Well, that's okay, because actually, if the proof of who a person is has to come out of them, what about biometrics? Biometrics are lovely, aren't they? We've all got them. I mean, I'm not about to change my genetics. My genes are what they are. I mean, it's such a complicated pile of stuff in there that nobody's going to do the kind of tampering to be able to replicate my genes in someone else. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, nature already did a pretty good job of that for us. So I think it's something like 1 in a million people have the same genetic fingerprint. Okay, in the UK, that's somewhere between 56 and 72 people who have the same genetic fingerprint on any particular sample that just happened to be picked up at a crime scene. That's actually quite a big sort of thing if, say, they all happen to be relatively closely related, which, funnily enough, does often tend to be the case, and they were all in the vicinity of the crime at roughly the same time, which people who often live together would be. That genetic fingerprint doesn't actually look like a very good way of identifying somebody at all. Oh, and of course, we have got the second-order stuff where people have become obsessed with electrocardiograms, electroencephalograms, and all of that. It's true that there is behavioral data that your body itself produces that you can do interesting machine learning models on. But do we trust machine learning models that much? So, in the real world, governments are always trying to tackle, really, this problem. It's really hard as a government. You do a whole pile of stuff that you've been asked to do by the citizens of your state. And you know you only really want to do it for them, because they're the ones who are paying the bills. And you want to make sure that they feel they're getting the service that they demand and that you're not putting them through too much pain. So bang, along come bureaucrats and say, well, we'll have ID cards then. ID cards look lovely because all kinds of complicated tech is applied to make sure they can't be forged easily. All of it can be replicated. They contain biometric data, which can be tampered with. And in general, nobody who ever presents an ID card anywhere has it properly scrutinized by a person who is properly trained in how to spot any of that? In other words, ID cards are solving entirely the wrong problem, which is a bureaucratic obsession. So, ID cards, bad. Okay, so let's say we have some miracle way of doing identity online. Let's say we've got it in our computers and we can now actually be certain that the still data we're taking at any instant is valid. Trouble is, really we need to take data over time, because if somebody pumps in that still data, remember, we don't control digital inputs to remote systems. We just don't. So if somebody pumps in that data and it looks right, well, how are we going to spot that it's not? So we then have a whole field that's grown up in recent years called liveness. Liveness detection is making sure that there really is a live person at your handset or your computer or your gate or whatever. Liveness is hilarious. I particularly love the iPhone hack at the bottom, because at present, yeah, that's a bit ropey, and so are the face recognition algorithms it cheats. But you've only got to look at what's happening with graphics cards design over the long term. You know, we're getting to the point where movies are going to have artificial characters rendered in real time with the whole body morphed thing and everything. Another 10 years after that, if that's not in every phone, it will be surprising. At which point, phones are perfectly capable of spoofing every kind of visual data we would expect to get from camera exploring a human being. So liveness itself is an absolute nightmare to do. And I'm going to get onto solutions to all of these problems in a bit, because it's something I've spent a lot of years banging my head against brick walls trying to solve. We also have what common wisdom now considers trust. This is where we move into the blockchain world. Now, trust is a funny old thing. Most of us, when we meet a new person, most of the time trust them to be telling the truth about who they are and why they're there. It's actually a very important part of the whole neurosocial thing that allows society to function. If we never trusted anybody, we would be incapable of going into new environments and having any kind of meaningful interaction that didn't involve hitting them with something for fear of what they were about to do to us when we misinterpreted some movement of theirs. And this is a very, you know, this is one of those things that, to anybody designing identity systems, is a nightmare. Why can't humans be like that? You know, I mean, yes, we'd have to make sure they never got within 6 feet of each other and ban any kind of projectile weaponry at all, which means even elastic bands. But at the same time, we could rely on them not to give away data they shouldn't, not to trust people they shouldn't, because their default setting would be, sorry, my firewall's up, no packets coming in. Instead, that firewall setting is, oh, look, packets, I love those. Add alcohol or whatever other recreational chemicals you can think of, and that goes from, I love packets, to, packets, you're my best friend. Oh, packets, why won't you, well, whatever. So, fraught stuff, this. Thankfully, for those of us who live in common law jurisdictions, we can boil all of this down to only one thing we care about for trust. Only one thing. It's something most people don't know enough about, and our European friends have a very different take on this. The Code Napoleon does not believe that this is a contract. But this is a contract in the common law world. There's a hand. There's a receipt. There's money. That's actually a contract. That down there, which you think of as a contract, isn't a contract. Well, it is in some jurisdictions, it isn't in others. In the UK, that signature is entirely optional. We call it a wet signature, and there's no requirement for them. None at all. A contract can be purely verbal, and that includes across the internet, where if your email client decides to just append a pro forma signature, that counts as you having agreed to whatever contractual arrangement happened to be in that email. Now, this sounds like absolute madness. How on earth can that work? Surely this means everybody's entering into contracts all the time that are about to get them in deep trouble. Well, yes, but the reason why that one at the top is a contract that is enforceable is because there is evidence. This one at the bottom actually isn't evidence. The signature isn't very good evidence. They're easy to fake. This one up here involves two people in a situation where they've exchanged stuff. They've had a knock-on effect in the real world. They've probably got witnesses who've seen them exchange stuff, which now means you can sit in court. One person can say about the brother, that's him, Your Honor. He done it. He never gave me my such and such that he says was coming from China within 4 days. And then the other party can stand up, but I didn't do that. It's not me. And I've got 15 non-friends of mine who were in the Starbucks over the road, all spying on me, who can all agree that. And that is how UK courts work. That's how American courts work, although you're more litigious over here about other things. But that is the essential of contracts. Is there evidence it happened? Now, legally, you have to roll back from that. Is there evidence there was intent to form that contract? Well, actually, yeah, there's a receipt, and I've got money in my till. That's all the evidence I need. So we're technologists. We somehow want to capture this mad bag of things that A, don't make sense, B, shouldn't be done, C, have no real meaningful digital reduction. And we somehow want to shove that through our crypto tool bag. Because obviously, we're going to use crypto. That's not because, okay, yeah, it's because we want to use crypto. Okay, I'll be honest. You can't work with a cryptographer and not wake up in the morning and go, gee, I wonder what we can do with crypto today. He's not going to enjoy watching this talk. He never likes me talking about our working relationship because it's like, but you're a loony, you don't know what you're doing. You give people the wrong impression. Which I do my best to do. So we have a very small tool bag of stuff that we use for pretty much everything. We use, I'm sorry, I'm about to make this camera have to move a bit, because I need to be over here briefly. So we have secure signatures, cryptographically secure signatures. Remember how MD5 is a really bad, oh, I'll get away from the speaker, is a really bad message catalog? It also happens to be a fundamentally good cryptographically secure signature if you use a HMAC with MD5. Oops, wrong button. Over here, we have our good friend Diffie-Hellman, which you can teach with clocks. I was really impressed. I've got a 9-year-old son, and when he was 7, they were doing modular arithmetic with them, with clocks and everything. It was great. For the first time in life, I was actually able to explain to somebody who was at just the right point with what they were doing how the stuff I do a lot of the time works, without having to make them unlearn all the other stuff they've learned after that. And it lasted for like a week, and then they ruined him, and they took him off into something else, and it was like, that was it. We also have the most useful thing in the whole world of cryptography, shared secrets. Our good old friend symmetric crypto. Now, everybody is obsessed with asymmetric crypto because you've got really big keys and Symmetric crypto is incredibly fast. It's much stronger for its bit length than anything that you will find in the asymmetric world. And frankly, it's the only thing you need if you really have to parse data. But guess what? Most of the time, we don't want to parse data. We want to parse proofs. We want to build a small data playbook with the other side of whoever we're talking to. That's part of how we know we trust them, because they understand what we say to them. And then the only things we want to say are proofs. Lovely things. I might actually end up a mathematician at this rate, which is a really... If my maths teachers from high school could see me, it would be like, but you were bomb at everything. I mean, I can't even do proper calculus. I somehow faked my way through a physics degree without even having proper understanding of calculus. So, my dirty secret. Now, we have one interesting bit of knowledge, and I'm, for the moment, going to leave this at face value. If there is a unique mapping between a piece of data and a very large random number, there is no way to actually figure out what the message being passed is without having that mapping. Okay? And I'm going to leave that as fundamentally true for the moment. It isn't as fundamentally true as Shannon thought it was, but it's a good starting point. Uniqueness has been something that our friends in the intelligence world have been loving since at least the 1890s, and possibly going back a lot further than that. But you get the first real one-time pad usage there in sort of the 1890s. And it revolutionized cryptographic messaging between agents in the field and their handlers. We are also interested in immutability. We want to prove, after we've done an exchange with someone, that what we sent them is what they received, and that there's no way we can have tampered with it to make it look like what they got isn't, or that they could have tampered with it to make it look like what they got was. We want to prevent forging, and that's what immutability is all about. There is an entire industry built on this one simple understanding of functional one-way linked lists. That's really all the blockchain world is doing. It's functional lists that happen to have proofs in. There is no magic. We also want to prove the integrity of that series of receipts, for want of a better word. Because we want to show that they turned up in the order we claim they did, and we want to show that they got broadcast in the order we claim they did, and we want to make sure nobody can interject their own versions of messages to corrupt our ledger. We're moving into the world of accounting. This is accounting 101. Keep two sets of ledgers, make sure they match up. It has the rather entertaining name Merkle tree. I'm going to show you something later that I call a Merkle forest, which is basically just let's plant a lot of trees and see how they grow together nicely. Architecture in this world is actually not that difficult as long as you've got the right primitives. If you approach these kinds of problems as we have to invent everything from basic arithmetic or something, you're really screwed. But if you just come up with some things that have good real-world analogs and you can actually understand those analogs, you can actually do a lot of transport architecture very easily. Blockchaining is really just sticking a series of those Merkle trees off in a linked list with a proof of the Merkle tree, which obviously is the top node. And it's got a few things that go wrong. Obviously, if you're Bitcoin, you're in a distributed system, so you need a consensus algorithm. But that's incredibly expensive on communication and the other interesting properties of it. And also, in the case of Bitcoin, forks can be a bit of a, I'm going to be careful with my language because I promised I would, an issue. I have a more fruity Anglo-Saxon word I normally use for that. The final thing is, we have to get these proofs around. We need to route stuff. We need to move stuff over live networks. The moment we step off our machine, until the moment we step onto somebody else's machine, we have no control over what's happening in between. We don't know how many nodes we'll go through. We don't know who's looking at those nodes. We don't know if perhaps an entire network segment is completely compromised by somebody with more computing power than we have, and therefore more capacity to undo what we have done than we have to do it. And obviously, we have some interesting stuff going on in the routing world. I mean, everybody's familiar with Tor, which may or may not have massive holes in it. I'm personally suspicious of anything that comes out of the US Naval Observatory as a secure communications mechanism if it's going to be used by the general public, because I wouldn't, as the US Naval Observatory, want the general public to be beyond my ability to see. That's just me being honest about the fact I quite like peeking inside the data, which is the worst possible thing. We all are a bit like it. We're all a bit prurient in the way we approach life. Ultimately, we need to find ways that even if we route through really hostile nodes, we can do so without anybody spotting what we are doing. I'm going to have to speed up. So, my claim to fame is that I devised an identity system that worked, having had a previous claim to fame that I must have devised at least a dozen that didn't. It's not quite as fast as inventing the steam hammer, because unfortunately the iteration cycles on identity systems is much slower, mostly because there's a lot of arguing with other very clever people, and the more clever people in the room, the less likely the solution will actually turn out to work, in my experience. So we devised this little thing, and we have a set of principles behind it. Mostly, we just don't want the system to be surveillable. We want it to allow law enforcement to arrest people who've committed fraud, but we want you, as the person who's the victim, to be the trigger for that happening. We don't want the state to just go, oh, well, we can spot all the frauds anyway. Because quite frankly, that's not how our legal systems in common law jurisdictions work. I can see why a European country might go for that, but in the Anglo-Saxon world, that doesn't really fit our legal tradition. In fact, it runs so counter to it, I can just, basically. And we only had one real requirement for this system. Our one requirement was, can you prove that a random person over the internet is 18? The actual person, not the machine they're on, not the credit card owner for the card that they're using, but them. And this is actually a very important commercial thing in the UK, because a few years back, and this is quite funny, really, because I never thought I'd end up working on something that's main use case was porn, but not really my area of interest. But there was a very famous case involving Playboy TV. They had for years been taking credit card imprints to allow their users to access porn over the internet. The law has always said it has to actually be a proof of the person being over 18 and not anything else. And finally, the regulators knew there was no solution to the problem. So they took an awful long time to get round to finally letting this come to court. But it came to court, I think it was 2015. And sat there at the High Court, a judge says, well, clearly it doesn't comply with the law. Bang! At that instant, and this is still an unsolved problem, really, as far as the porn industry is concerned, because they don't really like the solution that we came up with, and the client we did it for is actually more interested in grabbing students for student housing. Long story. But anyway, since then, they've all been operating illegally. They've been allowing people to still get into their sites on credit cards, and the regulator is saying, often says, that's very naughty. Prove that you're trying to do something to solve this. And so that was our one thing. Is somebody over the age of 18? I know nothing else about them. I want to know nothing else about them. I only have to show the regulator proof they were over the age of 18. Nothing else. Out of that flows an entire system. Now, the system architecture over there is kind of dull. You've got an anchoring system. You've got a secure store, which I'm not going to go into detail about right now, but it's inferable from the rest. And you've got to anchor against something in the real world. So the only proof of being over 18 we have in the UK is a passport or possibly a driving license. Well, people who have driving licenses don't always have photo ID driving licenses. I mean, my partner's got a 25-year-old paper driving license that's still thoroughly valid and legal. It's got a massive set of holes in the middle that make it almost unreadable, but it is a valid driving license and has no desire to get one with a pretty picture of a face on. So that wasn't really a good choice, because we'd have to deal with random documents with holes and no photos or anything. Okay? Then we're back to the deed of change name. So the passport is the one thing you can anchor on. You've got two things you can do. You can anchor on an OCR scan. That is not actually a very good anchoring. Those are tamperable, very easily tamperable. But you know what? Most of the world is letting people in and out of their countries based on grainy photo. Oh, okay. So it's not a bad one. There's also a whole pile of digital stuff in there. I mean, a lot of countries now have e-passports. There's a massive, great big ICAO standard that's almost completely incomprehensible and sent me to sleep by page 3, which my business partner is an expert on. But most countries don't apply it correctly. So, for example, UK passports don't reliably give you an actual photo. Now, for the purposes of doing stuff over the internet, your face is what I really need. Having your fingerprint isn't very useful to me because I don't have a trusted fingerprint reader. But I do have a camera most of the time in your device, so I want your face. We don't want to store any of the detail about you, though, so there's a whole interesting pile of stuff that then has to go on. So the registration is kind of dull. I mean, this is what businesses obsess over. Are we getting the right data? But it's really not very interesting to me. What's interesting to me is this, transactions. See, you can have an identity system in which absolutely nothing is known about you and you're completely untrusted when you first come into it. But if your behavior in the system is going to build up some kind of blockchain, a blockchain I don't need to be able to see. I don't need to see who you've transacted with. I only need to know those transactions are going on. And I need them to be able to see whether or not other people have trusted you, which is a very different question. Then over time, even though I know nothing about you, you can become a very trusted actor. You can become somebody the whole world will go, absolutely solid. If you were China, social credit rating, whatever. If you were the UK, your Experian value would be really good and you're likely to get a car loan. So, different priorities. And this little bit of magic down at the bottom, what tickles me is the fact this can be done with photons. The patents describe it in UDP packets because it's the smallest you're going to do in a computer system in the modern world. But this can be done with slightly colored photons interacting. I give you something. a big random number that I can only use once. You combine it with a big random number that you can only use once, and you give it to a black box storage service that knows nothing about your details, it only knows your random numbers. And then it gives you and me together, right? It gives us two halves of a proof that that transaction happened. I get the half related to you, you get the half related to me. It's like we just changed it. Basically, I've effectively patented a quantum business card. It is nothing more complex than that. The math behind some of it is nightmarish, but as a result, we can now start to build up an entire infrastructure around this concept that's just transactional, nothing else. Anonymous black box transactions. Now, I say I want your face, though. Why do I want your face? Because the only use case for the data that you've got from me and I've got from you is in a court. And I need to be able to show a piece of evidence. The you that I interacted with, whether locally or remotely, was the you that that actual large random number was associated with. And the easiest way to do that is actually to store a face. Now, most people want to stick faces in searchable databases. They want to be able to go find the face as the index. And there's some fine tech for that. I have a friend who can do 4,000 face matches a second on his Dell laptop using a bit of technology, a little trick called an LBP, a local binary pattern. They're incredibly accurate. They're within 0.2% of the accuracy of actual commercial facial recognition systems. But the trouble is, I don't want to search on your face. It's none of my business as the black box provider. You want to be able to show the photo of the other person in court with a barrister or lawyer, as you call them, attorney, as you call them. And I want my barrister, whose main skill is making people sweat when they're lying, to be able to say, are you honestly saying, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, that this beautiful glossy 1920 by 1080 photo of you with the speckling down the left side of your nose from your Rosicrucian and whatever, are you really telling me that this was not you, that my client was cheated by? And then 9 times out of 10, that person's going to be so cacking themselves that they're going to go, honestly, it wasn't me, and the jury's going to go, you're shifty, you've done it. And that's what we call the court test. It's the only thing we care about. However, you and I, when we transact, we care about a lot more than that. We want to swap some information. Say I'm an automated system. I need to know you're over 18. Actually, I don't want you to tell me you're over 18. I want to know your date of birth. I want to calculate that for myself. It's an important scaling reduction on the central server. I do not want a dynamic interpreter in the middle of a black box data store, even as a Rubyist. But also, at the same time, you need to actually run your own process to confirm for yourself that the data you're getting gives the answer you want. That's not my business. My business is making sure that the proof is there when you need it, that that was the data. And so we reframed attribute-based systems in terms of profiles. Profiles are basically nothing more and nothing less than a web form. They're a key value set. I don't really understand why the attribute world can't get its head around the fact that you can have 3 separate values for name in a particular piece of data. They just really won't get their head around it. I think there's too many engineers involved, for want of a better term. But as a result of this, we have the underpinnings for the proofs, we have the way of transmitting data, we have no insight into that data. So we're off to a really good start from an ID system. If the police kick our door in and take our database, good luck. Every single bit of data in the system, and the only trick for the secure store is this, every single bit of data is encrypted with a different key. And the only 2 parties who have the key for the encrypted data are actually the 2 people who just transacted. And the shared key between them is actually the transaction ID. It's just a really big random number that may or may not be used again. There's an interesting point there. If you never use the number again, actually your system is less secure. But if you do use the number again, your system is less trustworthy. If you never use it again, you see, you've just opened yourself up to a whole new class of traffic analysis attacks, because every time that number is seen, that number now defines that record. So when I say that Shannon is true up until a point, that's because Shannon wasn't thinking about these things happening in large networks that might have repeated randomness. So we added in this idea of confidence, which is really just a stolen credit score from Experian, basically. Let's run an Experian-style credit scoring network. It just happens to be on if you're trustworthy in transactions. Oh, wait a sec, that is Experian. Pity they didn't patent it first, really. And then we've got these things, receipts. Now, what's cool to me about receipts is actually this entire structure is just quantum entanglement. It doesn't look like quantum entanglement because people get horribly complicated explanations of this at university. But quantum entanglement is really just two bits of data that, funny enough, live remotely and happen to be correlated. And the odd thing in our system is it's a frozen entanglement. There's no way to de-entangle the data because of the blockchain, which itself is another blockchain down these blockchains, which is, hopefully I'll get onto in a sec. So yes, what we are doing over here is you do the transaction. There's this bunch of data that's the actual stuff that flies backwards and forwards between you. This here maps back to your previous transaction, the other person's previous transaction, which are black boxes to us, but we can then allow somebody who's got a whole set of those transactions to come back and see whether or not that set correlates with any of the partial evidence. So it's a partial derivative attack, basically, on it. For face recognition, well, I've said some new things about face recognition, but the LBP stuff is fascinating. And the only bit of a face that really matters for face recognition is this here. That's it. That's the only bit that most algorithms are really focused on. Liveness, though, is a nightmare. There's actually really no very good method when you just think about faces to come up with a way of proving a face is live. Oh, look, it's moving. Well, a video clip would move. The only way you can prove a face is live is to trigger at least two events with a random set of parameters that you provide and make sure the data that comes back correlates with the two random events. Well, we've got a bit of smoke and mirrors going on here. We use pupil dilation, which is a known fixed response curve, and a couple of flashes to effectively cause the pupil to dilate twice, and we take photos of that or video of it, doesn't really matter. That's not actually how we prove the liveness. I mean, this is a timing pulse. This is just putting a clock in the system, nothing else. Timing pulses are really good. If you can find places to put clocks in your systems, do. They're lovely. I love clocks. What got me into geekdom in the first place was disassembling every clock in the house and not being able to get most of them to work ever again. This down here is how we're actually doing it. We're actually using properties of the eye moving during this time cycle, this time window, to follow an elliptic curve that's used to generate movement data for a piece of text on the screen. The elliptic curve is a shared secret unique to just your handset for you and our central server for communicating with the random numbers that you're sending in to prove you. So as a result, we get a genuine biometric liveness as long as we can take your face and we can send out two pulses. Needless to say, it took a hell of a long time to come up with that, and I have to, for the timing pulse, I have to thank a friend of mine, Georgios, who, being a misapplied cyberneticist who dropped out of medicine, was just like, I know what we can do to put that clock in if you want a clock. We can play with people's pupils. So it differs depending, obviously, on their intoxication state, but the response curve still produces the same characteristic form. Device liveness, though. Now, this is something nobody else talks about because nobody else can do it. And it's not because it's difficult. It's just because nobody else actually seems to care. Nobody cares about whether or not the device that I'm getting your data from itself is alive. I'd love to be able to do some kind of electrometric that would actually tell me it was your chip and everything. But as of yet, I just don't know how to do that. That's going to be years of... I mean, I saw an interesting Black Hat talk, actually, in which a guy manages to tease the machine registers to tell him about this little embedded processor inside an x86 chip that VIA make. And I can't help but feel there might be something there, but it's below my competence level. Yeah, I go there. I don't go in there. But to detect your devices live, I need to actually get signals from you over more than one network loop. And I need to actually get that yet again within a time window. Now, that's going to fail a lot of the time because the internet is a really lousy transmission mechanism on occasion, as I always find whenever I travel, when I need it most. But we can do this little thing that allows us to effectively use the biometric liveness to send back its data through two completely different out-of-band channels, combine them in a way that only we know how the internal routing for that works, which is why the MTTR stuff appeals to me. And then we can say, yep, your device is live, and then we can say your face is live, and then we can say you've got the right random number, and then we can give it to the other party. Now, this stuff, unfortunately, slows down the beauty of the 4 UDP packet, well, the 3 UDP packet sequence, which is about as minimal as you can get. I can't think of a way of getting more minimal than that. But as a result, you can do an entire identity stack, and this is the only talk in the world that will show you how to do an entire digital identity stack from scratch. I hope it was worth the 12 years of my life it's taken to figure this out. Because I've had a lot of this at home about why don't you get a proper job. Finally, to add a few bits in, so one of the junior programs who was working on that project, when they were actually starting to implement it, spotted that effectively you could man in the middle a website because we were using the mobile phone to actually set up identity. So we're scanning something out of a website, and of course you can man in the middle of a website. So this little thing, this allows us to actually force the remote server to log into our phone and gives us a secure back channel, so we can now monitor what should be on that screen. Effectively, anytime you can get a secure back channel, get it. Because now you can monitor what's going on. And more to the point, now, if my son is viewing porn on the internet from his device, I can have that all set up so my phone gets the back channel and I can say, no, you're bloody not, and log him out. So it's a logout. Effectively, it's a logout button for a second system. This one I'm always in two minds about whether to include in this talk, because effectively this tells you how to break the entire system. This is where we're entering the world of traffic analysis or flow analysis, depending on how you prefer to name it. So the reason that Shannon breaks down is Shannon wasn't thinking about the statistical properties of a whole pile of different communications all going on at the same time. And the more slavishly you follow Shannon, the more you build up these big spikes saying, I don't know what you're saying, but I know you're saying something. So everybody here has probably heard the story of Enigma and how we cracked the Nazi codes and how we won the war. That wasn't how we won the war. There was a little hut at Bletchley Park called Hut 6, run by a chap called Gordon Welchman, and all he did was map out the entire European Axis communications network, and then just watched how all of that traffic was going on and correlated that data with random bits of intelligence from the field. That actually told us an awful lot more about what Germany was doing and what Italy was doing than any broken Enigma cipher. You know? And that was stuff that could be running 24/7. That's your actual live monitoring system. So that's actually the world we live in on the internet. There are actors who are doing that. Some of them are actors that I approve of them doing it because they're doing it for the right reasons. There are others who are not doing it for the right reasons. Many of them are private sectors sort of actors who aren't doing it for the right reasons. And if we can protect our users from that sort of thing, it's our obligation to do it. Because otherwise we're giving them a false sense of security, and that's the worst sense of security there is. If you want to find out more, our website is not very informative. We're a startup, self-funding effectively in our own bedrooms. Because the last thing you want, we've got a new system that basically is completely unlike this one, and this is 4-year-old research, which is why I can talk about it now. But if you want to find out how to have lots of fun playing with crypto and networking, I have loads of slide decks explaining how to do it in Ruby and how to do it in Go, which are 2 languages I mostly play with. There's some other stuff in there as well about privacy and so forth. There are also at least, I think, 11 patent applications in the USPTO that are all public domain, which is the other reason I can talk about all this stuff, because it's the first time I've ever worked on an identity system that wasn't under commercial confidence and NDAs. This one is in the public. For those who hate patents, I loathe the patent system, but that allows people like me to tell you how stuff that you would never get a chance to hear about works. Somebody think up a better way of this happening, please. I lost 18 months of my life to the patent system. It isn't easy. Thank you very much for being a good audience and for only a few of you disappearing off. And I hope you have a good conference.